Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg UK. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, with war in Ukraine and heated debate around the possible data threat of companies like TikTok, today's show is a deep dive into British security policy. So what role does the UK play in the global security order? As one of the founding members of NATO, the UK continues to play a key role, leading the call to support Ukraine following Russia's invasion last year. Now, the UK has also been instrumental in intelligence sharing. MI6 Chief Richard Moore tweeted last year about working with the US to uncover Putin's plans for Ukraine. Critics said Brexit could damage the security relationship with Brussels, but thawing relations amid war in Europe and the Windsor Framework could lead to closer ties. Then there's a Five Eyes intelligence partnership between the UK, the US, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. And then US, a wide-ranging security partnership which will see the UK and the US providing Australia with nuclear-powered submarines to counter Chinese naval threats in the Indo-Pacific. Earlier this month, the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said China poses what he called an epoch-defining challenge to the international world order. Well, Sunak has also committed to spending £20 billion a year on technology innovation, including AI and cyber security. Now, in a moment, we'll be speaking to Sir Richard Dearlove, who was in charge of the UK's foreign spy agency, MI6. He was at the heart of British secret intelligence for nearly 40 years, including during the invasion of Iraq. But first, let's get straight to our expert panel. Bloomberg's Jordan Robertson covers security, Ross Matheson on geopolitics and the biggest threats to the UK, and Tim Craighead from Bloomberg Intelligence on UK military and defense. So thank you all for joining us. Ross, let's start off with you. If you look at security around the world, of course, the world has become much more uncertain since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What does the UK fit in all of this?
Well, as you were noting, the UK really is embedded in a lot of the security architecture around the world. Obviously, a key member of NATO in the AUKUS grouping with Australia and the US on submarines, and obviously the Five Eyes intelligence sharing operation also. But since Brexit, of course, the UK is no longer part of the EU, and so there's a sense that some of that kind of coordination it has gone, and the UK really is to a greater extent defining its own future when it comes to foreign policy and security. And how does that mean the UK responds to some of those kind of growing global threats, not just Russia with its invasion of Ukraine, but obviously the growing influence of China globally, the use of cyber war globally, the rise of other non-state actors. And these are real fundamental challenges for the UK to think about, and what kind of alliances can it have that it can join up with other countries to sort of counter those things. It's very much aligning itself with the US, for example, against China. It's been a very strong critic of Russia for its war in Ukraine. But what about the threats that are coming directly to the UK potentially over the years from that? There doesn't seem to be a lot of strategic thinking going on about that in particular.
And Jordan, when you look at the threats looking at us at the moment, of course, partly it's on the battlefield, especially when we look at the horrific images from Ukraine. But cybersecurity is really the next frontier. Have these threats become more complicated and more intuitive to deal with?
Sure. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, one of the things that didn't happen was a major cyber war along the lines of what we've seen in the past. Or what many people feared. But what did happen was, Russia's invasion showed that cyber weapons are a natural complement to traditional kinetic, military weapons. And, the UK's role in this, the UK has vast diplomatic and intelligence gathering reach, despite Brexit. And the UK will play a very big role, in the future in terms of gathering big data, sharing data with its intelligence partners and its military partners.
But this is what, is it from state-sponsored threats or is it private threats?
Both. It's a good question, because what's happened in the last, especially decade, is the tools for cyber attacks have become democratized. So you have cyber hacking criminal groups who have access to the same tools and cyber weapons as, in many cases, nation states. So the difference between them is has become blurred, whether it's in the UK or the US or throughout Europe.
Tim, so you cover this from, of course, a business angle, right? When you look at defense spending overall, it's increased across major Western economies. What's it looking like in the UK?
So I guess there are a couple of things here to consider. Number one, it's definitely ramping, both in the wake, as we've discussed, with Russia invading Ukraine, as well as the ongoing concern about what's going on from China and Asia. The UK has increased its budget. I think we're all aware it got a significant potential spur when Liz Truss came in, and it was going to be 3% of GDP. It's now pulled back under Sunak's perspective, and the 2% sort of number still seems right. That's increasing as it is elsewhere. The thing that's interesting to consider, though, is what's happening with that budget spend with Russia, Ukraine, versus what would have happened if that conflict hadn't occurred. A lot of it's going to munitions and refilling supply on the ground. Some of these bigger issues longer term are more oriented towards air and sea and cyber. And is there a deflection of some of that strategic spend that's happening because you've got to have tanks and munitions and other things in Ukraine? That's an interesting conflict.
And Tim, overall, the UK, I mean, we think about, Lockheed Martin, a lot of the big companies. Actually, the UK has a lot of defense companies.
There are. It's actually, it's a significant employer across the UK, a significant amount of revenue. Some of that certainly is coming from U.S. defense primes, but specifically in the UK, think BAE Systems and think Rolls-Royce. They're both quite critical, and BAE is in an interesting situation because not only are they involved with European programs like the Typhoon from a plane, but they're a tier 1 defense supplier for the U.S. involved on ships, planes, tanks, et cetera, and certainly they're involved now with this Australian JV.
Roz, if you look at intelligence sharing, I mean, this is really one of the big takeaways from Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that, especially the U.S., of course, authorities had leaked it, people knew about it. I imagine it helped also the Ukraine, the politicians to prepare for it. Post-Brexit, what does intelligence sharing look like?
Well, certainly at least the Five Eyes intelligence grouping is still very much intact and very robust. And as you say, it was highly unusual to see the US releasing so publicly the level of intelligence that they gleaned about Russia before it went into Ukraine and indeed after the invasion happened. That's been quite unusual. And that intelligence has been clearly shared not just between the US and UK, but also the US and Europe and big intelligence sharing operations that are going on within Europe itself. So that machinery seems to be pretty much intact. And certainly, despite Brexit, there's a sense that that needs to continue happening, even if the UK says they want to sort of forge their own path to some extent when it comes to foreign policy, when it comes to its own security architecture. There's a recognition that it's the interests of everybody to do so. The question is, how does that translate to other challenges as they go on? For example, again, China. In the longer term, as the US says, the real challenge geopolitically around the world is going to be a multipolar existence with the US and China both as superpowers. And so how does that intelligence sharing translate to that? But right now, it seems pretty robust.
So who's the biggest ally of the UK, Roz, right now in terms of intelligence sharing? I imagine the US is still more important than the EU.
You'd have to say so. And obviously, there's been a long-standing transatlantic special relationship, as they like to say, between the US and the UK. And that's hit a few bumps in the road in recent years, but seems to be on a pretty good track at the moment. And certainly the AUKUS deal on submarines points to that. So certainly you'd have to say that probably the biggest sort of security ally at the moment for the UK is the US.
And Jordan, when you look at cybersecurity, and again, we think a lot about state-sponsored, attacks versus, against, for example, government websites, but it can also be a private website. How's the UK in trying to counteract some of these threats? Are they doing a good job? They seem to be investing quite a lot in it.
The cybersecurity industry is bigger than it's ever been. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry every year, and that includes the UK, right? I mean, the UK as a central hub for banking and the financial services. That's one of the biggest markets for cybersecurity technologies. The banks buy more cybersecurity technologies than most other industries. So as a result, there's a really healthy ecosystem in the UK, maybe not perhaps of the startups that you would see in the US, but in terms of consumption and in terms of the number of people employed in the UK, in cyber roles, that number is actually pretty high relative to the UK size. So as a result of that, what you have is a lot of intelligence being gathered and a lot of information being gathered. And as a result, the UK remains a very important partner for the US and Europe because of that. They see a lot.
They see a lot. Thank you all for a fantastic panel. Jordan Robertson, Ros Matheson, and Tim Craighead. Now, coming up, more coverage on UK security. Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of Britain's MI6 spy agency, joins us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to our special coverage on UK security policy. Now, joining us now is Sir Richard Dearlove. He was at the heart of British secret intelligence for 38 years and served as head of MI6 from 1999 to 2004. Sir Richard was the country's top spy during the invasion of Iraq. Well, he joins us now, former head of Britain's MI6 spy agency. Sir Richard, thank you for joining us. So when you look at intelligence sharing, how has the war in Ukraine, but also Brexit, changed the place of the UK in the world?
Well, I think it's important to understand that Brexit probably hasn't made a great deal of difference to what happens in Europe, because the policy of the UK was really to make sure that the European Commission did not have much purchase on its national security policy. So as a result of that, I mean, life has continued pretty much as it was before and after. I think what I would say is Ukraine has, of course, acted as a catalyst and probably pushed the UK again to the forefront of European security, particularly in the intelligence and security field. I mean, the UK remains really the primary intelligence and security nation or power in the European context. And I think you can assume it's played a massively important role, both in the build-up to war in Ukraine and now in terms of helping the Ukrainians and playing a central role in the alliance of nations supporting Ukraine.
So Richard, what would make it even more prominent? Is there anything that the UK needs to do? I don't know whether it's common platforms with its allies beyond some of the bilateral agreements that would give it more prominence for intelligence sharing.
I would have thought that the situation is probably operating at an optimum. And I think that the misleading view of Brexit is that it might have changed things. Look, it didn't really change much at all, because the UK, as I've said already, was very careful not to put national security equities into the hands of Brussels. It wasn't a publicly stated policy, but it was pretty clear throughout that period that, we weren't going to, as it were, allow the EU much say in those areas. It was done very discreetly.
From the time you were head of MI6 to now, what do you think that the biggest changes have been in terms of defense and security threats? Has it moved tactically to everything online, to cybersecurity threats?
Obviously, the technology now plays a much greater role in both intelligence collection and, intelligence vulnerabilities. I think that's quite obvious. So cyber becomes more prominent, and any sort of technical intelligence capability would be a much bigger deal. I mean, the collection of data, the analysis of data. And I think, during my career, I was really in the foothills of those issues. We hadn't yet, as it were, climbed the mountains. But I mean, now I think, I think it's important to accept, though, that human intelligence sources and human intelligence collection probably still remains a core activity. So, you've got to look at the balance of those two issues, how all those various sources, collection sources, are integrated. So the world probably is more complex. And I think the other thing one has to acknowledge, that there's much more public awareness now of the role of intelligence collection agencies in crises. And I mean, look at the build-up to the war in Ukraine, when a lot of sensitive intelligence was publicized before the invasion actually happened.
Yeah, that was the first time I saw anything like that. What did you think at the time when this intelligence, we were told then that this was to basically prevent Vladimir Putin from attacking Ukraine and saying it was their fault?
Yeah, well, I think that there have been some famous historical examples. Go back to Cuba and the Cuban crisis, which was really before my career even started. That was a prime example. Another example, topical because it's the 20th anniversary, is the war in Iraq. And okay, mistakes were made, and one ended up in a rather different analysis after the event of what had happened. But I know there have always been occasions in international relations where intelligence has been used.
No.
But I think this was probably a prime example, and maybe one of the most impressive. And the US and the UK, I think, got this absolutely right this time.
So, Richard, how do you expect the war in Ukraine to end? Will Vladimir Putin be deposed? And what is the role in the UK in this?
I think it's far too early to say. At the moment, we have a conflict of attrition. I think if it goes bad militarily for the Russians and things are not going well for them, then there is probably a fragility about Putin's situation in Russia. And I think one could possibly see that evolve towards some sort of coup, some sort of political change in Moscow. But I don't think we should rely on that as a prediction. I think a lot will depend on what happens in the next 6 to 8 months. I think we're on the cusp probably of a Ukrainian spring offensive. The Ukrainians are very good at, as it were, misleading the media into saying it's not going to happen now. But I think one should anticipate something dramatic will happen in the next few months in the conflict.
And is it clear to you if China is a friend or a foe in this conflict, actually, to the West?
I think China's position is deliberately ambiguous. Obviously, there is an alliance of interest at the moment between Russia and China. But I think China is, as it were, handling that relationship with caution, and China will be calculating where does the advantage in this situation lie for China. I mean, we've just seen in Beijing, something equivalent to the Davos Chinese gathering attended by a lot of Western businesses. So we have to realize, that China's economy is intertwined with the West. This is not a Cold War situation. China will play its cards carefully. And, despite the expressions of friendship expressed during Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow, I think one can see there is caution in the way the Chinese are handling this.
So, Richard, thank you so much. So, Richard Dearlove, former head of Britain's MI6 spy agency, stays with us, and we'll talk a little bit about the new threats out there. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to our special coverage on UK security policy. So Richard Dearlove, former head of Britain's foreign spy agency MI6, is still with us. So Richard, when you look at non-state actors and the threats that they pose, is there a new threat emerging that we haven't thought about yet?
I wouldn't say there's a new threat emerging, but I think one should appreciate the seriousness that organizations which are not nation states, or as it were, aspire to be significant globally, can mount threats and create problems. I mean, we're all familiar with the terrorist organizations that have been so problematic, both before, but particularly since 9/11. There are very sophisticated criminal organizations which operate like global businesses, particularly, in areas like the drugs trade, people trafficking. I mean, we're familiar with those types of problem and the difficulties of dealing with them. So, yeah, there are important players. And I mean, one of the aspects of the technology that makes our lives so exciting and varied and convenient is that, you know, this same technology can be used to support the aspirations of,
Right.
of evil organizations.
Okay, would you consider TikTok evil? It's been banned from UK government devices. Is the UK government doing enough?
Well, it's been banned from official communications. I mean, the threat with TikTok and similar businesses, let's say based in China, is their ability to collect data, and the fact that that data, you know, remains on servers inside China. Now, we're all well aware of Chinese legislation. If the Chinese party leadership, the Chinese administration says to a company, jump, and the response is how high? I mean, they can't turn around and say no. And I think we all realize in this complex technological world that we live in, you know, I think the quotation I've heard, data is the new oil. I mean, data is power. Data can be used in a very manipulative fashion. So, I mean, there is a real problem with TikTok. And, you know, the enthusiasm of our youth for TikTok is, I think, unsettling in terms because they don't understand, you know, what the security implications are that lie behind it.
Do you see this as one of the biggest threats as the world becomes really, you know, polarized and bifurcated?
Well, I think if we, you know, if our competitive relationship with China turns into something much more serious, then we have empowered China through a certain degree of negligence by letting China, as it were, acquire a lot of data would be a powerful weapon if used against us. And I think one, you know, has to understand that, you know, China has an ulterior plan and an ulterior motive through to 2049 when it takes dominant superpowers.
Thank you so much, Sir Richard Dearlove, there, former head of MI6. This is Bloomberg.